Right.
So little.
Natural selection. Now, the process of natural selection is basically survival of the fittest. So you probably heard that term before, but I would add to that survival of the fittest in order for them to reproduce. Okay, so there are certain things that organisms do within a lifetime to keep themselves alive. Of course, one of the first ones is acquiring food. If you're out in the wild, you also want to avoid becoming food. You oftentimes need shelter. That's how you survive environmental extremes. That's helpful. But as all those things are, of course, very important to the individual. But the fact is that the species or the population doesn't care about the individual, at least in the animal kingdom or in the wild so much. They care about that individual reproducing and producing a new generation, because of course that's what will keep the species going. So that's a necessary thing. That's why the reproductive drive is there. Like I said, it does not help the individual organism at all. Other drives, such as the hunger drive, of course, are necessary so that you won't starve to death. But this is not something that you do for yourself, believe it or not. It is something that you're doing for the species. So, but don't use that as an excuse to your parents when you get pregnant. You did it for the species, Dad. Yeah, they won't take that. So there's a couple of things that are necessary to be classified as natural selection. There's a couple primary things you need to understand about the process itself. First of all, in order for it to work, so to speak, the adaptations that are helping that organism to survive in the environment, they have to be genetic. Because natural selection does not happen within the lifetime of an organism. It happens from generation to generation. Because basically what natural selection does to the individual organism is it either kills them or allows them to survive. Technically, it selects out the ones it wants to survive and the rest of them die. And don't pass on their genes. That's the important part. So we tend to talk about natural selection type changes as the things that happen to the entire population and things that happen to that population's gene pool. It basically changes the gene pool. And that's another thing I want to make sure you understand is that the organism itself, when they adapt, they don't genetically adapt within their lifetime. There's no mechanism at this point where your genetics will change in response to your environment. It just is that if you have the adaptive genetics in you that allows you to do so, you will then therefore survive and pass those adaptive genetics on the next generation. It doesn't. Your genes won't change to suit the situation, so to speak. So, from examples of that is if you have mammals that are distributed, like for example the black bears we have in Florida, versus the black bears that are in say North Carolina or some other more northern area, colder area. They're the same species. They could breed with each other, probably different subspecies, but they could breed with each other. However, at some point their populations got split up, theoretically, and those that ended up in the colder climates, they benefited and they were better able to survive, keep their body heat, etc., and survive the wintering and starvation because they were bigger and had better fur. I'm going to accept adaptive group 7 because that is technically a correct answer. But actually what we're looking for here is just simply that mammals in colder environments tend to be bigger. It's just a fact that a larger body, the ratio of internal body parts, that basically the parts that are making the heat, is per area of skin, the part that loses the heat to the environment, is greater in a bigger animal. It's like a bigger balloon, same thing. And therefore they're better adapted to it. Of course, thicker fur is better insulation. Probably more fat on those organisms as well. But like I said, they're still the same animal. They just happen to, those that are in that particular population happen to have more of those types of genes. Alrighty, so as mentioned earlier, the process of natural selection will sometimes go into idle. It will kind of go into an idle state and not really be exercised once the population stabilizes around the type of characteristics that are best adapted for that environment, right? So the ones that have survived, they pass their genes on, their children are like that, their offspring, and so on. Everybody's happy, everybody's well adapted to their environment. Then you have environmental change. So when you have environmental change, then the process of natural selection will reactivate, so to speak. Because typically, when that environmental change takes place, you're going to have some members of the population of that species that are actually better off in the new environment than they were in the old environment. And then you're going to have a part of that population that was better off in the old environment and not so good in the new environment. So that means the ones that are better in the new environment, they're going to, of course, survive and pass those traits on, and therefore, effectively, the entire gene pool will change in that direction. So I'll give you an example. One of the most common examples that you'll see, and that's one of the things about natural selection also, as opposed to long-term evolution, is natural selection is observable. We have some very concrete examples of it, and it presents a practical problem for a lot of people. For example, with pesticide resistance. So let's say you're a farmer and you're growing potatoes, and you start to notice little holes in the leaves of the plants, and you realize that you have potato beetles. And so you go out and spray your crop, and it just so happens that within that potato beetle population, let's say maybe 10% of those beetles in that population had this particular gene or the variation, what we call an allele of the gene, that made them have thick exoskeletons, right? And that thick exoskeleton was, when they were unsprayed, so to speak, was not necessarily that much of an advantage. That's why there's not a whole lot of it around. It maybe made the bugs slower, so they couldn't get to the food supply as quick as other ones, or maybe made them less attractive to other potato beetles, etc. But for whatever reason, that was a smaller part of the gene pool, was that thick exoskeleton trait. However, once that environmental change takes place, in this case the introduction of a poison in the form of pesticides to that population, then that thick exoskeleton actually becomes an advantage because it keeps the pesticide from penetrating into the insect as much, and they survive. And so consequently, they then will reproduce, and their offspring will tend to have that thick exoskeleton. And if you keep going on with that a couple times, of course, insects reproduce pretty quickly, you pretty soon have a whole population of thick-shelled or thick exoskeleton potato beetles. Okay, so as you can see now, there's still the same species of potato beetles, but what has happened is that the population as a whole has gone from 10% thick to maybe, let's say, 80% thick. Okay, yes?
I have a question. Okay.
Sure.
In your opinion,
yeah,
do you believe that lifeguards interfere with natural selection?
Lifeguards?
Yeah, like if you
that's an interesting, that's a very good point. And I've had a discussion many times that in general, humans are fighting against natural selection. We do a lot of stuff that is counter to natural selection, and you could even make the argument that those of us in the environment, or people that are in the environment that are in some ways less fit, I don't want to go too much judgment there, but are actually the ones that are reproducing the most. That's very counter natural selection. And this change has only happened in the past probably 75 to 100 years. Even at the turn of the 20th century, it was still a popular thing to have big families if you could afford it and stuff. Now that's actually not the case so much, but we'll talk about that more when we talk about human populations. But you make a very good point. Yes, yes, by saving someone's life because they either didn't know how to swim or did something stupid by going out when they shouldn't have, means that they can pass those same stupid genes on to their children, and their children will go out and but it gives the lifeguards a job. So. But I'm glad you brought that up because that is actually counter natural selection process. Natural selection, folks, is cruel. That's all there is to it. It is a cruel thing. Nature is cruel. I hate to say it, as much as I love nature, it is, as a process, it is amoral. All right, so what do you think is going to happen when that farmer goes out and sprays the crop again when it starts to see the potato beetle damage? Is it going to be very effective? No, that beetle population is going to be pesticide resistant. Okay, the same thing happens with antibiotics, and this is even more of a problem. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Now, Staph aureus is a pretty common bacteria, but what has happened through, typically, they believe through the use of daily antibiotics.
Teachers and students, please for interruption. We are still, and I repeat, we are still in a code red lockdown, code yellow lockdown at this time. The campus is safe. There is no need to be worried, but I just wanted to keep you informed that we are still in a code yellow lockdown.
Okay, so if schools like
Yellow.
in whatever I was saying that, like seems like we're allowed to leave. You guys, do we?
I know I'm red.
I don't
I'm
know.
readily definitely.
Anything.
I'm readily definitely keep you over because at my old school they kept us for over an hour.
Oh, yeah, no, that's all
Over
that-
a
there's-
thing, but I don't know about
Bread.
you. Yeah, we were there for over an hour because we had a gun.
Alrighty, this will make for good video. So, with the MRSA, what has happened because they believe because of continued, like a daily use of antibiotics or excessive use of antibiotics because people are getting prescribed when perhaps they don't need it, you have basically done the same thing. You've killed off all but the resistant bacteria, and therefore, if and when you do get a MRSA type infection as opposed to just an average everyday staph infection, then you've got problems. Fortunately, they do have antibiotics, very strong antibiotics, and can handle them. But a lot of times it requires that you go into the hospital and get on an IV, and the antibiotics themselves it can be dangerous too. So that's another example. I'll talk about the peppered moth one next week. That's a classic study that actually shows that process as well. Okay, so in order for population to be able to go through the process of natural selection when there's an environmental change and survive, they have to have those different genes in there. So, for example, it was good that those beetles had that 10% of the population that had the thick exoskeleton, even though at that particular time it wasn't helping them out any, right? So what it does help is when that environmental change takes place, you've got those adaptive genes available. So that's what's called genetic diversity. Good job, Group 5, in getting that. A lot of people are putting biodiversity. This one is the correct diversity this time. And like I said, that means that they're going to have those genes in there, more likely to have those genes in there to survive when there is environmental change. And the one thing we know about the environment, it is going to change, whether naturally or human-induced, but it will change. And the primary way in which this is produced, in which we ensure genetic diversity in populations, is through sexual reproduction. That's the only thing it's good for, folks. Believe it or not, it's actually much less efficient than asexual reproduction. You can take a bacteria and it can go through binary fission, and within 24 hours there can be 1 million of them. Okay. So sexual reproduction is, you have to find the mate. There's a danger in that process. There's all kinds of other things that are a problem, but it means that you're taking two organisms, bless you, then mixing their DNA together. Therefore, that makes for you only get one. It makes for a more varied genetic makeup. Okay. We clear on natural selection, when it happens, why it happens. What are some of the things that are necessary for it to happen, environmental change and genetics, diversity, and those kind of things. And examples, make sure you're familiar with these examples and can describe them if asked to. Okay, so that leads us to the niche or niches. Basically what these are is the role that an organism plays in an ecosystem. So they've all, you've got your food chain, of course, that defines a lot of the roles that organisms play in an ecosystem, but there's a lot of other things that they do as well, oftentimes. And they have something called a fundamental niche, and that's basically what that organism can survive in and what it has a capacity to do for itself, as well as the way it interacts with other organisms. Okay, so that's what's called a fundamental niche. It's defined by its range of tolerance, among other things, but that's one of the main things. In other words, what can it take? Can it live in an area where the temperatures go down to -40 degrees, for example? Can it survive when you have a drought most of the year? Can it, if it's a plant, can it live in the desert for long periods of time and tolerate low levels of those particular resources? So you have that, but usually what happens in an ecosystem, because of course species can vary quite a bit, just like the black bears here versus the black bears in North Carolina, is that when they're in that ecosystem, their specific ecosystem, interacting with other organisms, interacting with the specific environment there, they end up filling into what's called the realized niche. And the realized niche is kind of a subset of the fundamental niche. So they can do all these things, for example, but they end up being in the one that fits best for them. And I like the analogy of a sports team, particularly a sports team that has particular roles, like a football team. A person may have been an all-around athlete, and they could play running back or wide receiver or defense, but they end up being a free safety or something, because that's what the team needed. That's where they fit best on that team. They may go to a different team and play wide receiver. That means that all the different things they could do, that would be their fundamental niche. But the one particular one that they assume once they're there is what's called the realized niche. Okay. Now, certain species are well adapted. Many different things are very adaptable, like cockroaches, and rats are another example of that. Tend to be our pest species, and that's the reason why they do tend to be pests, because they can live through practically anything. And then we call those generalists, and then you have specialists, which have much more narrow tolerance ranges and things. And we'll talk about some of the examples of that next week when we talk about this. Any questions about different types of fundamental versus realized niche, and how an organism can be one thing, one ecosystem, and a different thing in a different one? All right. Species interact with each other through the food chain, provision of shelter, competition, reproductive assistance, and dispersal of seeds. So this is the many different things, ways in which one population affects another, both on the positive side and the negative side. Okay, so like competition, for example, is of course a negative interaction between two species. That doesn't mean it's bad, by the way. Through that process, the species becomes adapted, and you go through the natural selection process and everything else. But it does mean that it's a kind of like a stressor on those particular organisms. One of the things that we say happening when you get two species together that compete, and by the way, that's outside the food chain, that's the main way in which organisms will interact with each other. And that's important because it will affect how, when you make changes, as I mentioned back here with our level 4, what might happen if you make a change to a particular species. That's one of the main things you have to look at. You're not just going to look at, well, will it eat this or get eaten by this? More so, you have to look at, well, what is it competing with? What resources is it competing with another organism for? This is also what you see in the form of a lot of the aggressiveness that animals have towards each other in an environment when they have no desire to eat another organism, but they will be very territorial and possessive because you have to protect your resources in the wild. So that's a big one. And so sometimes species, actually a lot of times, they actually can work things out better than people do. We call that's a good answer. That might even be a correct answer in some terminology for that resource partitioning group 4. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a point for that. But we're going to call it niche partitioning, or niche. And I'll give you an example. The Anole lizards here, those are the lizards you see all around campus. Okay, what you see mainly are brown Anole lizards. Anybody ever seen the green ones, bright green ones? Yeah, every once in a while you'll see those. Those are the native Anole lizards. The brown ones are actually invasive species, or they're non-native species, mostly from the Caribbean area. And when I was a kid, way back when, you didn't see them. There was you would see the green ones, and you would see more of the green ones than you do now. And then, I guess around the 70s, etc., they really started, the populations of the brown ones started to dramatically increase. And at first they thought, well, you know what's happening is these brown ones, they're just out competing them. They're taking their food supply. In some instances, you do have aggression between the two, and they'll eat one another, particularly the young and the eggs and stuff like that. So ecologists were thinking, well, this brown anoles are really making a big impact on the green anoles. But then when they went into further research of it, what they found is actually the green anoles were still, the population numbers had not decreased that much, but they are now higher up in the trees. So what they had done was that they basically gave up the ground areas and the bushes and stuff to the brown anoles, and be the ones that were adapted to living in the trees and had good balance, and also, of course, their green color is better adapted up there where they'd be on the leaves and stuff. They stuck to that area. The brown ones stuck to the ground area, even though their fundamental niche covers the whole area. Their realized niche becomes upper canopy, if you will, for the green ones, and ground and lower bushes and stuff for the brown ones. And so there's very little interaction between the two of them, and therefore both species can get what they need to have. That's called niche partitioning. So they worked it out. They got together and said, hey, why fight all the time? You take this, I'll take that. All right. Then there's also some specific species that have certain crucial roles within an ecosystem. One of the examples of that is a foundation species, and another one's keystone species. And we'll go into some detail on the keystone one because they are literally very important when it comes to that ecosystem. And we'll look at some examples of things like that next week. Questions? Anybody?